for the conference. Well, my name is Tom Alves. I'm the Head of Development at AHURI, and it's my great pleasure to host this session for you this afternoon, or this morning, in the case of our two presenters who I'll introduce in just a moment. But before we begin, I guess for the information and the benefit particularly of our international speakers, who I think would be aware that here in Australia it's our practice to acknowledge country when we speak, to acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who have cared for and looked after and managed the land on which we're meeting today. And in our case here in Canberra, it's the Ngunnawal people. And I do pay my respects, and on your behalf pay respect to elders past and present. And I also want to acknowledge the several Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are participating in the conference with us over these few days, and we've very much valued the input this morning and indeed throughout the sessions of the conference from people from our First Nations around the country. On behalf of AHURI and Homelessness Australia, I'd like to also thank and acknowledge the generous support of our sponsor for today's plenary, and that is Link Wentworth, who are sponsoring the session today. Thank you. This session is being streamed and recorded, as indeed all of our plenaries are, and several of our concurrent sessions, and these will be available online to all delegates at the conclusion of the conference. We will be taking questions after our speakers have presented, both from our in-person and also our online audience. And I do encourage all of you to contribute your questions, particularly those of you joining us online. You can contribute questions that I will attempt to put to our speakers after their presentation. You do that by using the Q&A function that's on the right of your screens in the software that you're using to access the conference. And for the rest of you in the room, there will be the opportunity to ask questions, I believe, using the roving microphones, but also don't forget you can use the conference app, which hopefully you've downloaded on your phone. And that way you can deliver your question at any time throughout the presentation. So we've got them lined up and ready to go as soon as the presentation is complete. So with no further ado, I'll get on to introducing our speakers, and as they hopefully come on line on the screen in just a moment, I'll bid them good morning, and thank you very much, Maggie and Margaret, Maggie and Marion, for joining us today and getting up so early to be with us from Scotland this morning. We really do appreciate that extra effort that you've made, and also looking forward to your presentation. If again, using the conference app, you can read about Maggie and Marion. Their bios are available under the information for this particular session, but I will just very quickly introduce who they are. We have Marion Gibbs, who is the team leader of the Homelessness unit in the Scottish Government, and we have Margaret-Ann, or Maggie Brünjes, who is the Chief Executive of the Homelessness Network Scotland. As I say, please read more about them in their bios on the app. But the one thing I will say is both of them have been in their present or related roles in their organisations for at least 10 years and have worked together over a long period of time. So we're really going to value hearing about the fruitfulness of the partnership and the interaction that they've had over that period. Today's session is looking at Scotland's plan, Ending Homelessness Together action plan of the Scottish Government and the housing and homelessness sector in Scotland. And we began our conference, for your information, Maggie and Marion, with an address by our relatively recently appointed Federal Housing Minister here in Australia, where she signalled the Australian Government's intention to embark on the process of developing a plan here in Australia with all of our states and territories and our sectors in those states and territories to look at addressing and reducing and working towards ending homelessness here in Australia. So why would we invite people from overseas to come and talk to us? We had a session this morning looking at, I guess, well, we heard from the voices directly, the voices of our First Nations people, and you know, we have a situation in Australia which is obviously very different to Scotland, a very different context, and we need to chart our own course, obviously, in working out our own plan. But there is, I think, great value in looking at other nations and looking at people around the world who have done interesting, excellent things and achieved things that we can, I guess, gain inspiration from. So we're looking forward to hearing about the Scottish Ending Homelessness Together action plan as a great source of inspiration and something to, I guess, provoke our own thinking as we embark on a process here in Australia. So with no further ado, I would like now to thank our speakers and hand over to them. I believe they're doing a joint presentation, so I'll let them drive that, and they can switch back and forth and work things at their end. If there are any issues, please do sing out, and we'll do whatever we can at our end to make sure they're ironed out. But over to you. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Maggie. I work for an organisation called Homeless Network Scotland. Thank you so much for that incredibly useful introduction, and also to AHURI and to Homelessness Australia for inviting us along to the conference today. I think Marion and I are both a little bit gutted, to be honest, that we can't join you there in person. That would have been the absolute ideal situation. But second best is to be able to join you in this wonderful hall through the medium of technology. And hopefully we will be able to share with you some of our learning from Scotland. So first screen here, I suspect that in Australia you're probably a little bit bored of other countries showing you how small their country is and how it fits within yours. And the purpose that I think for us doing so, opening up here, is just from the very beginning to say that in any of the learning that we're going to share, in any of the successes that we've had in Scotland, and in any of the challenges that really continue, the real stubborn issues round about tackling homelessness in Scotland, that we share that in the full knowledge that the scale of what we're talking about here is so significantly smaller than the scale that you're talking about. So I hope that just helps to set out a little bit of context. But let's go on. One of the key themes, and I think in your opening, you shared the fact that Maddie and I had worked together for over 10 years. I think it might be over 20 years, actually in different roles. And the theme of partnership will thread right through our presentation, as will this theme that we open with, this idea that most of us, with the right support, can build and live our lives in an ordinary home as part of an ordinary community. Now, we'll return to this later, but this is a key theme for us and part of our learning and part of what we had to correct in our own approach and in our own kind of journey, I think, in working to end homelessness in Scotland. But let me share, first of all, how we will use this 45 minutes. In just one moment, I'll kick off and just provide a little bit of context, just a bit of a snapshot on the scale of homelessness in Scotland, how we define it, what drives it. I suspect that even though the scale is very different between Scotland and Australia, I think what we'll probably find is quite a lot of familiarity in terms of some of the drivers and some of the causes, and also some of the effects of homelessness. Next up, we would like to provide a bit of a timeline, and Marion will take over from there, between 2016. And now these are key relevant timescales in our context for reasons that Marion will explain. And this was Scotland putting in place really firm foundations that was giving a set of rights and options to people that were homeless in Scotland for the very first time. Rights that were considered to be the most progressive, at least in Europe, if not beyond. And that, in our story, had felt like fantastic progress that would enable us to get all the work to end homelessness right over the line. However, it didn't. And while Marion will explain some of the huge progress, the huge strides that were made in that period, it didn't end homelessness. And what we had to do is come back and look fresh from 2017 up to date, and correct our course a little. And put much greater emphasis on prevention and on pace. And we'll explain more of that as we come to it. And just finally, recognising that it's 3:30 where you are, a little bit beyond the end of your day, hopefully for us just to end on a note of cheerfulness, that there are some things happening in Scotland that despite all the challenges, there are good reasons to remain cheerful, and that we are now on the correct course. But of course, maybe you'll have us back in 10 years' time and we can demonstrate whether that's true or not. Okay. So the first of 4 sections. Throughout these slides, we'll just take the opportunity to do a little bit of tourist information, if that's okay. Please do take the opportunity to come visit. This is the Fourth Brünjes. Okay, so our population, as I said, quite radically different, is around 5.5 million people. Some very interesting research that was carried out relatively recently, which was looking at the entire population and asking the question, have you ever at any point in your life experienced homelessness? Opening our eyes wide was the kind of feedback to that survey that showed that 8% of the population indeed had 1 in 12 people. Now, what should be said, and I think it's important to share just in this opening the kind of phase of the presentation, that in Scotland, right back when we made those changes to the legal context, we created a very broad legal definition of homelessness that goes well beyond rough sleeping or street homelessness, and indeed includes people while in temporary accommodation, while waiting for a settled accommodation offer. So Marion will cover a little bit of that later on in terms of what that means. But when we describe homelessness, it includes people in temporary homeless accommodation. So the kind of legal definition is this one. That in Scotland, you're considered homeless if you have no accommodation that you are legally entitled to occupy. And that includes with you and other members of your household that you would seek to live with, so family or relationships or other. Or indeed, you would be considered homeless and therefore legally entitled to settled accommodation and temporary accommodation while waiting for settled accommodation if you do have accommodation, but for a number of different reasons, it may not be reasonable for you to continue to stay there. You cannot get entry to it for whatever reason, that by staying in it, it would lead to abuse or threats. Or it is a movable form of accommodation, caravan, houseboat, and there's just simply nowhere for you to put it. Or indeed, in the Scottish legal context, by staying in that accommodation, it would be overcrowded and endanger health. So a very broad definition of homelessness that we thought useful to share. So what drives homelessness in Scotland? And I suspect this will start to sound very familiar. The overwhelming driver of homelessness in Scotland in all its forms, so from sofa surfing to rough sleeping, is poverty and inequality. One of the kind of key academic institutions in Scotland, Heriot-Watt University, who operate across the UK and beyond as well, undertook a significant piece of research that just set out very clearly the correlation between poverty and homelessness in Scotland. So it is the main driver, with child poverty a key predictor of homelessness in later life. So that's what drives homelessness. And then, of course, at a local level, so across Scotland's 32 local authority areas. That interplays with the health of local housing markets, local labour markets, the extent to which there is enough work available for people that are able to work, and of course how that is underpinned by a welfare safety net. We'll pick up a little bit later in our slides how these different aspects have interplayed to influence either positively or negatively on the scale and extent of homelessness in Scotland. Okay, so here's our numbers. This is the latest data up to the end of the financial year 2021. With the 21-22 data not due till next week, so I'm sorry, we're just 1 week out of fresh figures, but nonetheless, this is the number of households, so households, not individual people, that were assessed as homeless in Scotland. This is counted by every local authority, of which there's 32, submitting a return to Scottish Government every year. Now, that number is 13% down on the pre-COVID measurement of 2019-20, but there are a number of COVID-related reasons for that, including a ban on evictions, for example, and other measures that were taken to make sure that people were protected and housed. So there's a kind of unique reasons for such a reduction over the course of 1 year. What we had seen, and we'll get into some of the reasons later, is small increases over a 3-year period in homelessness between 2017 up to 2019-20, which is the reason why we'd started putting in place that correcting action that we talked about. However, that did follow a year-on-year reduction over an 8-year period of around 40%. So you can see that we've had some highs and lows over that period. So moving on to the second section then of our presentation, and to introduce my colleague, Marion.
Hello there, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yep, that's great, because my face seems to be frozen in quite a stern sort of look at the moment. But as long as you can hear me, that's fine. I'll just try to make my voice light so I don't look as all the time. Thank you for that, Maggie, and thank you, conference, for inviting us to speak. It's always great to be able to cast our net wide, as it were, around what we're doing. So Maggie, if you can pass on to our next tourist information slide. So it's Edinburgh Castle, and that's where the Scottish Parliament is. So the important bit there is what happened. We got the Scottish Parliament. Interest in homelessness was early decided in that as well, which there was a homelessness task force, which took us to developing the Housing Scotland Act 2001, which was, in terms of homelessness, the main thing that is interesting there is that pre this act, to be homeless wasn't enough to get accommodation. You also had to overcome certain barriers around whether or not you were in priority need, which basically meant that there were children in the household, or there were vulnerable people in it for a particular reason. I won't go into them. I can tell you all about that if you've got questions on that. So that was introducing temporary accommodation for all homeless households. So that was a big major step forward there as well. And you can see that from our figures as well about how they increased. That led into the 2003 Homelessness, etc. Scotland Act, which was actually was pushing the boundaries even further. So what it was doing is it set up, as you will see from another couple of bullets, the fact that the priority need test, that test about vulnerability or children in the household, was going to be abolished. So a really important one, really at the forefront of that, but that was actually a real challenge. So it was going to be abolished by 2012, by the end of December 2012. And what in the Scottish Government, what we needed to do, working with our local government partners in the third sector, was to make sure that we prepared for that sort of introduction and very much pushed on the angle on prevention, which is the we introduced this sort of concept of housing options, so that people could come and get access to information and advice about what their housing options were, rather than simply just having to make a homelessness application. So that meant that it could be an exploration about prevention of homelessness, use of the private rented sector, what are the other things that are available for them. So that was a really important bit, and I'll come on to it in a minute, exactly how that looks, if you like, on that as well. It was a major aspect of our development. Then in 2010, we had the Housing Scotland Act, which basically introduced a right to housing support. So we were trying to lay the foundations for making sure that people got access to settled accommodation, but also access to support. And that meant that we could actually lay some of the groundwork for developing housing first, which I think is a really important point there as well. That sort of like housing and support being hand in hand, not one without the other, but making sure that they spoke to each other and helped people through this sort of like period of time. Then in 2012, in November 2012, the Scottish Parliament passed the secondary legislation, which meant that the priority need test was abolished. And so from the 31st of December 2012, there was no extra barrier to getting access to settled accommodation for single people who had been excluded so much from the good homelessness provisions that we had. So that was a real sort of like highlight for us all involved in homelessness in Scotland, that we actually got there without the system crashing, basically, because it was such a important part of the vision and the ambition of not just Scottish Parliament, but wider than that, the whole sector involved in homelessness. And then in 2016, what we have is the integration of health and social care. Again, recognition of that aspect, that it's not just housing on its own, but we need health, we need social care, we need everybody to talk to each other and pull all of that together. So that's a really important part of where we've got to now. It's not perfect. There are some areas where in Scotland it's working really, really well in terms of like linking to homelessness, and one of those is particularly Glasgow. And some other ones are developing really good sort of like approaches there as well, but that's still an area that we've got a long way to go. Next slide, Maggie. Thanks. And just to give a bit of an idea about the structure that we're talking on, I made a sort of like nod to it earlier on, but the national planning structure is the Homelessness Prevention and Strategy Group, and it's co-chaired by our Cabinet Secretary on many things, but including homelessness, and the convener of COSLA, which is our umbrella body of local authorities. As Maggie's mentioned a couple of times, there are 32 local authorities in Scotland, and we wanted to make sure that we joined hands with our colleagues in local government as well, about how we do that. And if you see that sort of like how it comes down, we've got 5 regional delivery structures. We've cut Scotland up, as it were, into 5 areas. There's a big story behind all of that, but it meant that we had groups of local authorities coming together in the housing option hubs, looking at housing options, looking at ways of sharing experience, learning, training in a way that had never happened before. Each local authority before then had been quite siloed sort of like aspect to it, with only some cross local authority work. So this is a way of being able to really push the prevention agenda and get all local authorities on board with that, and their partners in other sectors, to try to make sure that it all came together. So that was how we really did it. Again, that sort of like idea of partnership work being the really important one. And members of my team go along to each of the housing option hubs meetings so that we can give people an update about what we're doing, but also understand the intelligence that's happening on the ground. So Next slide, the impact of stronger rights and options. So you'd have thought that with that platform, that firm foundation, that we would have got there. But as Maggie hinted at the start, we made some progress, but didn't manage to achieve the overall ambition of ending homelessness together. So between 2007-8 and 16-17, we had a 41% reduction in the number of statutory homeless applicants, and a 32% reduction in those applicants assessed as homeless. You can see the figures there. So, you know, we did make an impact in terms of like preventing homelessness. We did change that around a lot, but it went up after 16-17, not by huge amounts, but enough to sort of say job's not done. So the trend started to reverse with more people staying longer in temporary accommodation, despite more rights and more focused housing options. And even though this sort of like makes a nod to what Maggie's going to bring you on to, I think it's really important to tell you the impact COVID had on temporary accommodation in Scotland, in that homelessness applications didn't increase during COVID, but the requirements for temporary accommodation did. So we're now in a position where we've got a lot of people in temporary accommodation that we're trying to get into settled accommodation. It's just been hard to do that. So why has this happened? UK government policy across the same period, and when Maggie and I were preparing for this, Maggie was clear to check with me as to whether I'd be allowed to say some of these things. And it's very clear that, yeah, this is exactly what the Scottish Government has been challenging the UK government on all the time. It's a really important set of principles here. The Scottish Government is totally against the welfare reforms agenda that came in since 2010, caps on benefit, bedroom tax, the Immigration Act and hostile environment policy, meaning that there was a sort of like, even though UK government have that as a reserved matter, Scottish Government were knocking on the door saying, look, we need to improve this. We've got a lot of people who need to be assisted in that as well. And there was also austerity instead of stimulus to respond to the recession, which meant that it was just very difficult to make all of the inroads that we were wanting to do so with our partners. And in Scotland, it's not just the UK government that we see the sort of like the issues with, but the supply of housing is not meeting the current levels of need. That's why we have the number of people in temporary accommodation that we currently do. Over-reliance on temporary housing as an unintended consequence of universal right to housing in 2012. At least it means people were getting access to accommodation, but it's not long-term, it's not sustainable, it's not the right kind in the right place. So we needed to move on that, and not enough focus on. So I think that's a really important part of that as well. And one thing that we're really aware of is the implementation gap. We've got great policies, we've got great sort of like ambition, vision, ways forward there. We're all working in the same direction, but it just takes time to actually get things implemented and put into place in a way which will actually benefit people who are affected by homelessness. So handing back to Maggie.
Thank you so much, Marion, and that's us moving on to the third of 4 sections. And as Marion said, this moves us into periods now over the last 5 years, where in many ways it was a bit of back to drawing board. We started seeing some of the figures creep back up. It was just 1% or so, a couple of % 1 year increase in homelessness, but it was enough for us to recognise that something's not going right. And that we needed to kind of almost think again as to what we might do differently. There was a number of things happening, as you would expect, around about this time. There was some great lobbying done by NGOs in Scotland about the need for a kind of national plan, and that having this fantastic legal framework can be really bolstered by a national, a national ambition, some vision, some outcomes. So a lot of things coalesced. And just throw in the Harry Potter train there. Absolutely wonderful. And I guess what was changing as well was people's understanding and interpretation of the problem. The culture round about housing and homelessness was changing. And I guess this idea that what we were better understanding was that all homelessness starts in the community, that the evidence was pointing to the fact that poverty was driving it. And really looking at what had been created to respond to that was, instead of homelessness happening, people being squeezed out their housing, their community, the right to, the right to good health, the right to live and build their lives in that local area. They were being squeezed out of that. And instead of supporting people back into that community, we built a whole homeless system around them. Now, I've no doubt this will sound familiar. It's kind of what almost all countries have done, that we somehow treated people differently in a different system, as opposed to recognising that it's people in communities being squeezed out of a community, and therefore the solution should be located there. And then, of course, what happens with the system that isn't working is that we add another layer and another layer of good intention until you have an incredibly complex system that is just really difficult for people to navigate, and also increasingly expensive for local authorities to sustain. It just wasn't adding up. And of course, we all know that it costs more to keep people homeless than it does to resolve it. The human cost, of course, but also the very practical and real costs at local and national level. So the culture that was changing, that was one that was much more towards one which identified that, knowing all this, that communities with healthy housing and labour markets will prevent homelessness earlier, and that we really need to value the importance of community connections, of relationships, of creating stronger and protecting factor for homelessness. And all that would, of course, mean the need for people to spend far less time in temporary accommodation to prevent it happening in the first place. And if it does happen, to rapidly rehouse people. So here's a bit of a timeline of then what happened over that period. Just given that kind of emergence of new understanding, reflection, some strong lobbying. There was a parliamentary inquiry that opened in 2017 in the Scottish Parliament. That's a cross-party parliamentary committee. And its sole focus was to get to the bottom of why there had been this slight increase in homelessness over the period, and to propose solutions. In the SNP's programme for government the same year, homelessness was also made a priority, so also responding to the emergence of new understanding and new energy about getting to the grips of the problem. So homelessness was made a priority, and Scottish ministers appointed an action group of around 12 people, I believe it was. I was really happy to take my place on that action group, and it was made up of NGOs, Scottish Government providing a secretariat, organisations representing local authorities directly, as well as the umbrella organisation that Marion mentioned, an important organisation in Scotland called the AHURI, which is the Association of Local Authority Chief Housing Officers, were represented, who subsequently became absolutely pivotal in the recommendations being enabled, and just a key learning from us. If you can get your local government housing officers subscribing to change around homelessness, for us, it really accelerated progress. And a big part of what the action group did, and part of our role also, was to open up access to experiences of people who were affected by homelessness at that time, who were using homelessness services. And we facilitated a programme which was called We Can We End Homelessness in Scotland? And spoke to over 400 people with personal experience of homelessness to ask what priorities are, and what they want to see, and what they want to see less of. And it was an incredibly compelling programme that directly influenced the recommendations that the group made. So all concurrently, this parliamentary inquiry reported in 2018, it made a set of important recommendations and which put the model of housing first at the very heart of their recommendations. Now that was key for us. Housing First had been a model that was very small in Scotland and since 2010. So I think Scotland adopted Housing First the first time across the UK, but we didn't capitalise on it, we didn't build from it. So it remained a very small project in Glasgow. And what everybody started to understand was that it needed to go much further and faster. And the parliamentary inquiry made that a central recommendation. Shortly later, the HARSAG, as it was called, pretty unfortunate, which was the Homelessness and Rough Sleeping Action Group that had been appointed by the Scottish Government. It made a series of over 100 recommendations. Now, we can provide links if anybody wants to go through the detail of that, of course. And what I'll do shortly is just try and succinct it into 4 key headings, but really wide-ranging recommendations, which put the idea of rapid rehousing at the absolute cornerstone. So recognise that in Scotland's context, the need for us to move people through temporary accommodation much faster, to put a greater focus on prevention, would need an approach that centred housing. And that was the part that we hadn't done before. We gave people rights, but we didn't actually centre the access or supply of the housing that people would need to exercise those rights. So the idea of rapid rehousing was one that would recognise that the quicker we can get people through their experience of homelessness, where it hasn't been prevented, the better. What's important to note, RRTP, which is the Rapid Rehousing Transition Plan, was that the HARSAG, so this cross-agency action group, made first of all the recommendation round about rapid rehousing and also commissioned a method and a tool for local government to develop their own rapid rehousing transition plan based on local context and local markets. So it was a really useful guidance document that came not from Scottish Government, but actually came from this cross-agency group, which was very unique and unusual. And actually it meant that we were all, we were all curious to see how well that would be adopted. Now, one of the key threads that we talked about round about partnership meant that when Scottish Government then invited every local authority to return their rapid rehousing transition plan, that return went directly to Marion. And because of the relationships that had been built over that period of time, I think all but one, but Marion can connect me, all but one, and then eventually all local authority returned a rapid rehousing transition plan. So that was incredibly important for us culturally, that there was no legal requirement on local government to do so, but they did so, that people had bought in to the notion of the HARSAG itself and the recommendations it was making over a series of reports. So the full set of recommendations, as I said, it was a very long report. It was all condensed and distilled into what was called a high-level action plan. Now that was the key document that was published by Scottish Government in partnership with COSLA. Again, that's that umbrella organisation for Scottish local authorities. So that was 2018. That full action plan was published with the vision, as you would expect, to end homelessness in Scotland, setting out the range of measures and actions that it would take, centering rapid rehousing, including Housing First, as a primary method to enable us to get there. Given COVID and all the additional anxieties and complexities that raised, HARSAG was actually reconvened by invitation of the Minister in 2020 and made a subsequent 90-odd recommendations to underpin really the recovery from the pandemic period. What's notable is that the platform that had been created through the rapid rehousing transition plans was described by local authorities themselves as the very platform that was needed for recovery. So what had been put in place before the pandemic was described as the right platform for recovery. The partnerships that had been pulled together locally and nationally, the focus on housing, on prevention, on supporting people in a person-centred way. That preparatory work was taken very much by local authorities as kind of almost a defence against the pandemic itself, and that felt very fortuitous indeed. So just to draw that the Scottish Government then of course updated that national plan in the light of the new recommendations that the action group had made. Now, what was happening alongside this was the need to focus much more on preventing homelessness happening in the first place, and that will feel very familiar to all of us in this room, of course. And what we decided to do in Scotland, and on the back of a HARSAG recommendation, is actually legislate for that. Now, I guess some of that's coming from the place of Scotland, being considered to have some of the best policy round about homelessness. Still, we have that implementation gap, which just simply means, not all policy is being implemented on the ground to the benefit of people, and we know that. But we thought that the framework of ensuring that people have rights that can be levered through advocacy and through activism where needed is such an important starting point, that people know that they have the right to something. And from there, of course, the work that needs to be done to ensure that the resources and the options can match that. So the prevention group was convened by a national charity in the UK called Crisis, and invited key people again across different agencies to make a series of recommendations. And the group went so far as to draft the legislation. So those duties, importantly, are duties no longer just in housing and homelessness departments of local government, but right across the wider public sector. And I think this is probably key for all of us. It's kind of, if you work in homelessness, it's almost too late, isn't it, to respond to homelessness in the way we want to. That it really has to be people that don't work in homelessness that take that mantle, that take that responsibility on. So this includes people across wider health and social care, housing associations, GPs, criminal justice, community justice. So really all these other partners across other sectors will have a duty to prevent homelessness. So that legislation has been consulted on, and we expect to see some enactment over the coming months and years. Probably just key to throw in here is a key policy document, Housing to 2040. So talking about what we learned around giving people rights and options, not ending homelessness, and the need for greater housing supply. So Scottish Government consulted very widely and published in 2021 a long-term strategy for housing in Scotland, which sets in place the number of mechanisms that need to combine to ensure that everybody has access to the home that they need. So this includes targets based on independently calculated forecasts around how much housing is needed for everyone. So that's key. That brings the supply part of the jigsaw into play. And what felt absolutely key for us in the back of this was the further development of Housing First from this small pilot in Glasgow that I described right out into a national pathfinder. So 5 cities across 6 areas were involved in a Scottish Government and social entrepreneur funded initiative over 3 years to figure out how best to scale Housing First, to take it from small project to citywide intervention. And since the Pathfinder is further extended across a number of local authorities. So now the majority, 27 out of 32 authorities so far in Scotland are providing Housing First, and over 1,000 tenancies have been provided. So Housing First in Scotland is a bit of a bright spot for us. So the screen in front of you, and again, we can provide any links that people are interested in. The top left is the guidance that the Housing and Homelessness and Rough Sleeping Action Group produced for local authorities. There was research and guidance to enable that to happen, and below that is a snapshot of the National Ending Homelessness Together plan. Now, as I said, there is no way that you want to sit through you know, the 100 odd recommendations that have been made over that course, but broadly, what it set in place was 4 new directions that, as described, prioritised prevention, including the use of new legal powers, that focused more on settled housing options instead of temporary, that really charged us all to increase our competence around about equalities, making sure that people are getting the right response, and increasing our knowledge and response to the fact that each of us will experience homelessness differently, and that the risk and distribution of risk is different for different groups, with some of us more affected. And broadly around about responsive systems, about making sure that there's a much more person-centeredness to what we were trying to achieve. So just very quickly, the intention of all that change was, of course, to prevent homelessness, to accelerate housing into ordinary housing as part of an ordinary community, to reduce time and temporary accommodation, housing first to be targeted to redress severe disadvantage, and wrapping around as much or as little support as that people need, with the assumption being, this is our theory of change, that less people become and stay homeless overall, that we get better outcomes for people that are centred around what they need and want, that we use temporary accommodation less, that more people sustain accommodation, that we have a much better and more targeted response for people whose homelessness is just made harder by other experiences, including trauma, with mental health, with addiction. And the bottom line in all of this, of course, is that this should be, and has been proven to be in other areas, more cost effective for national and local government too, better for people, and costing less as well. Now let me just end on before I pass back to Marion on what's an interesting interpretation of how we are going to match housing options against housing need. And this has been this culture change for us. So that in our context, around half of people that are assessed as homeless have no support needs beyond their need for housing. Of those that do, of course, includes a group of people, you know, with severe and multiple disadvantages and often quite complex support needs. So really the type of scale that we're talking is most people, the vast majority of people, you know, into the 90% of people, it's about ordinary housing in an ordinary community. Some with the intensity of support that is provided by the Housing First response. What we've also found through our investigation of Housing First and research around that is that there will be a small amount of people that need or want shared accommodation with support on site. But that's around 2 to 5% and smaller than the number of people that could be supported around about Housing First. So that's where all our kind of investigation and research led us to. And back over to you, Marion.
Hey, thanks, Maggie. Yeah, some really interesting things that we've all learned going down the road. But again, it's that whole partnership, collaboration, how important all that is. So moving on to some reasons to be cheerful. So we can sort of say that, yeah, we've all got challenges, but we do have means of being able to like overcome these. And that's a lovely photograph of Glasgow, which is actually where the homelessness team is mainly based, unlike most of the Scottish Government, because it's recognising the fact that Glasgow is the area that has the greatest incidence of homelessness as well. And we work very closely with colleagues across the city to take things forward. So what we have here is about sort of the shared ownership and outcome monitoring and the collective leadership around homelessness across the piece, irrespective of what sector you're in, and crucially involving lived experience, and therefore having people's lived experience informing our policy development and how we can take things further forward and really sort of like meet the needs of people there as well. We can't sort of like come away from this without sort of saying that this is a really high political ambition in this agenda here as well. Maggie spoke about the action group, and basically the First Minister, so our highest politician, she sort of handpicked, selected those people. So not in the way that normal civil servants put up advice and then, you know, there's a bit of negotiation or whatever. This was the First Minister down from Programme for Government and further than that, but that sort of like personal influence on it as well is really, really key, and means that everybody's sort of like in the same direction. I think that it would be wrong to say that everybody's got it right all the time, but I think what happens is that sometimes Scottish Government gets a bit of a sort of like criticism, if you like, because it's maybe not going as fast as other parts of the sector would like us to do. But I think that when you really place it in the political framework, you can see that we've got all that buy-in, we've got all that positivity, we've all got all the same direction of travel and how we do it as well. So we're not wasting time, money, effort by sort of infighting, but we're all trying to get to the same conclusion there as well, which I think is really important. That brings me on to the second box there around the collective impact, and we're developing an outcomes framework at the moment to capture all the work that's being done through the Ending Homelessness Together action plans, to make sure that we actually have a way of illustrating what we're actually about here as well, which is really useful. So where are we now? As things stand, lowest levels of sleeping on record. There was a huge piece of work done when COVID hit, and it was something about trying to like help people, protect people, get them safe, secure, and you know, all that as well. So the main cities where off sleeping is dominant, really worked hard to get people off the streets during that time, and that's sustained now as well. I just off my holidays, so I don't know quite what the latest figures are, but before I went off, it was something like, and people who are sleeping rough are not unconnected into street teams and things like that as well. They've made certain decisions, have been forced them down that route, but they're still connected into services. They're not left on their own. Part of COVID as well was that we ended communal night shelter provision in Scotland. It was really important that we actually got people safe. And although that was particularly over the winter months, that was a sort of like response for that. It was like saying that's not appropriate. And it's always been sort of like an ambition to get rid of that and to stop it happening. And glad to see that that's exactly what's happened. I've talked about the high ambition from national and local government, from housing and health, and mentioned about how that can be patchy, but it's moving in the right direction. And with the prevention duties that Maggie's spoken about, potentially then we've got a bit more of leverage about getting that to work. A strong collective, everyone home, formed across the non-government organisations and the academic sector. So pull all that work together and we tap into that as we move forward. The new duties to prevent homelessness across the wider public sector are on the pipeline, and Housing First at the helm to redress severe and multiple disadvantage is one of the most exciting areas of the work that I'm involved in now, about how it's actually moving through, and for having so many local authorities actually embarking on Housing First in all its different sort of like facets. So Housing First for youth, Housing First for focus on people leaving prison, Housing First for women fleeing domestic abuse, are all sort of projects that are happening across Scotland alongside just helping people who have got multiple disadvantages. So I think this is a really important lesson that we've got there as well. Now Maggie's just going to share with us an animation, and that'll be the end of the formal part of our presentation, and then it'll be over to questions and answers. On you go, Maggie.
In Scotland, we are putting housing first. Housing First is a national priority so that all of us can build and live our lives in an ordinary home as part of an ordinary community. Housing First means safety. It means choice and peace of mind. The best place for positive mental health to reduce harm and to recover from addictions and trauma. the Scottish Government has committed to scale up Housing First, a national framework to branch out right across the country and all councils with a local plan to achieve it. Best evidence tells us that we need around 3,500 Housing First tenancies each year over 10 years. While the highest demand is in urban areas, all 32 of Scotland's councils have people in their area who could thrive with a Housing First approach. There are 4 pillars that will support Housing First to branch out across the country. This is provided by Homeless Network Scotland in partnership with the Scottish Government. Housing First Connect, to make sure we're working together across all boundaries to plan and deliver Housing First. Why? To connect, to swap notes, and to understand each other's priorities and challenges. How? With a programme of conferences, events, seminars, networks and briefings, in person and online, and a monthly news bulletin to keep you right up to date. Housing First Know-How, to gather and share the best knowledge, evidence and expertise on Housing First. Why? So that we can target it accurately, cost it efficiently and deliver it effectively. How? Branching out is the national framework for Housing First, and where all know-how is collected and updated. Housing First Checkup, to help plan, cost and deliver Housing First according to the national framework. Learning, coaching, exploring, supporting, benchmarking, together. Why? Because Housing First works when it is delivered in the right way. How? We will collect data 4 times each year, and we will facilitate an annual checkup, getting alongside each local authority lead to gather insights from tenants and partners, reflect on progress, be a sounding board, an expert outside perspective in confidence, present a shared solutions report for next steps. Housing First Academy, to support partners at all levels with training delivered by experienced practitioners. Why? To support knowledgeable, confident and expert professionals who plan, commission and deliver great Housing First. How? By delivering training directly to practitioners and managers, online and in person. The Academy is led by Turning Point Scotland, and now in partnership with Homeless Network Scotland, the learning opportunities are being extended. Housing First Connect, Know-How, Checkup and Academy. This is Housing First Scotland and is for everyone who is helping Housing First become the first response for people going through tough times. Housing First is normal, it's fairer, it works, and we all benefit. Find out how we can help you at www.housingfirst.scot or contact us at housingfirst@homelessnetwork.scot or housingfirstscotland@gov.scot.
Well, thank you very much, Maggie and Marion, for that very clear and excellent presentation of Scotland's, the story of Scotland's Ending Homelessness Together action plan, how it's been developed over a long history, and also a bit of a snapshot of where it's at now. And I encourage people to continue sending in questions, because we're going to have a bit of a Q&A session with Maggie and Marion now. And I want to kick off that session by asking you both, with the Scotland's Ending Homelessness Together action plan, you've talked a lot about homelessness and how the Scottish Government and the sector is working together to seek to end homelessness. But we've been discussing a lot over the last few days, I guess, the fact that there are very different cohorts of people who experience homelessness. Older women being one, women and children escaping from a situation of family violence being another, youth being yet another significant group of homeless people, and in Australia, of course, an Indigenous population as well. Can you just comment a little bit about, I guess, how the plan works and what, in terms of the process of developing the plan, what is effectively a fairly broad action plan for ending homelessness actually also then tackles the needs of different homeless cohorts. Can you both comment on that, please, as a start?
Shall I kick off, Maggie? Yeah. Okay. Just to sort of, there we go. I still have it still iced in there. Basically, I think it's a really interesting question. Is what we're doing is that we've got a number of prevention pathways, as we call them, which focus on particular groups of people who are at risk of different types of homelessness, to try to address the things there as well. So that's one aspect of it. The second one is we have the rapid rehousing transition plans that get refreshed, or at least their action plan gets refreshed every year and comes into my team, who provide feedback and all the rest of it. So it gives us an opportunity of really making sure that some of our priority cohorts are in there as well. And that's all backed by equality impact assessments around all of that as well. So it's very much a theme of what we want to look at, is sort of preventing it amongst all these different groups. So stop people getting damaged by the actual experience of being homeless. I think it's a really important point that we're trying to do. So we're trying to take the prevention upstream and do that as well. And prevention duties will help with that, but that's not to say we're not been doing it already. Maggie, do you want to add to that?
I mean, spot on, and the 3 points that you made there, Marion, round about the kind of equality impact assessment, the rapid rehousing transition plans, and the overall plan is absolutely key. It recognises, I think, as our understanding has increased, that the distribution of risk is different for different groups. And perhaps traditionally, historically, we haven't been as good at responding to that. I think because the knowledge wasn't there. What there has been, especially since the second sitting of that action group, has been a much stronger push to make sure that when we're talking about responsive systems, we're doing that in a way that understands and responds to the different distribution of risk, and the fact that we will experience homelessness differently as a result of different characteristics that we might have protected inequalities legislation in Scotland, and also other aspects of our life, including poverty and and disadvantage. So it's absolutely key that what the national plan does is set the framework and expectation around that, and what the local plans do, as Marion described, is invite local authorities to consider the local profile and pattern of homelessness, and how responses should be more targeted toward the needs of different groups.
Thank you. Before we go to a question in the room, I've just got one more from the online contributors. But if you have a question in the room, can you please raise your hand, and one of the people with the microphone will come and stand by you, ready to have your question asked to our international panellists. But firstly, I just wanted to ask you, or actually I'm going to put a couple of questions together here. One is asking around investment in public housing in Scotland, and I guess how, or if increasing investment or bringing more public housing online was part of or connected to the Ending Homelessness Together action plan, and just bringing that bringing another question in here, which I think is a bit related, was also asking about, I guess, about the governance of that too, and is there an overarching authority in Scotland that does sort of provide funding to the local authorities, and if so, what is the nature of that kind of funding to sustain housing programs?
Shall I do the Scottish Government bit, Maggie, and you can come?
Marion, that'd be great.
Yeah. Okay. In terms of investment in public housing, then that's a really strong aspect of the current Scottish Government's sort of approach to it as well. And it's backed by £6.3 billion sterling of investment in there over a period of time to construct, buy back, whatever, 110,000 housing to get that moving forward. It's a real challenge. And you asked about the agency that sort of did all that. That's Scottish Government basically working with local authorities and housing associations in the country to just make sure it's all going in the right place. Again, it's that sort of like central government will provide the sort of like the high level bit there, but then that goes down to the local authorities to determine what their need and demand is in their area, and then the Scottish Government will, obviously scrutinise that, but then fund it accordingly. So I think that's sort of like the framework that we have. It's all kept. I think one of the things that we probably haven't touched on, even though Maggie had it on our first slide, Scotland's really small, and we sort of like all work interdependently on all of this as well. So we sort of know all the players and things like that. So it's not as though we need to like have a massive construct somewhere. It's a bit about just how we can tweak things to make them work better. I think it's a really important message to get across. The homelessness sector, if you like, really knows each other really well, probably too well at times. And I think that it's just one of those sort of like aspects that we take for granted. And I think that's possibly unfair because it is such a strong vehicle for performance and for moving things forward.
Thank you.
I would just add to that, I knew Marion would have the cost model and number there, but she absolutely did. And maybe just to add to that, because I think maybe in the room, if there are any kind of charitable advocacy, NGO organisations, that it would be fair to say that a couple of the big campaigning NGOs in Scotland were critical in moving the dial on this. And of course, there would be other aspects, including Scottish Government themselves and local government, kind of making the case for more housing. But there really was a push on it. And when I talk about the kind of second phase, when we started having to correct our course, it was exactly because we recognised that we hadn't properly centred housing supply alongside housing rights. So bringing housing supply into that correcting action was absolutely key. So the 110,000 target that Marion talked about, importantly, is based on independently calculated rates in terms of what's needed, rather than just politicians saying we think it might be this amount. And that feels very key and reassuring as well.
Thank you. Do we have a question in the room? Yep, there's one here. Thank you. Go for it. Yep.
Oh, thanks.
Thanks, Kate.
My name's Kate Colvin from the Everybody's Home campaign. I just had a particular question for Maggie, which was about what you were just mentioning about organisations really pushing the dial on the government, because I'm just really so enormously impressed with your housing strategy and wondered what kind of advocacy it took to achieve such an amazing plan.
Thank you so much. And it is a really interesting question. And I think it's a really interesting part of the story for us in Scotland has been the very close involvement of what we call the third sector, so the non-governmental organisation sector, and actually the expertise of particularly big campaigning organisations in Scotland. We would pay particular mention to Shelter Scotland, who've just been absolutely uncompromising over many years on the need for more homes, and in fact their very latest kind of campaign has been absolutely focused on that and continues to be. So that steadfastness of advocates and activists has been incredibly important in making sure that the dial moved on this issue. What I would say alongside this, and it's quite an interesting angle, I think, particularly in some of the partnership work we've done with European organisations, is that typically, I think, in many organisations, in many countries rather, when you see big change on social issues, it's mostly down to the efforts of kind of charitable activists and advocates. And what I might suggest that's different in Scotland is that actually what we would find is that some of the most progressive voices are located within national and local government. Now, I'm not just saying that because Marion's here. I mean that quite sincerely, and that's been a flavour of kind of, I guess, the progress that we've been working to over the last decade at least, and maybe a bit longer, is that the type of political culture is perhaps a bit different from other parts of the UK. It's very enabling. It's a small country. We're very close to our parliament. And the people that work within it and the civil servants that support it are very accessible. So I guess for us, if you can find those progressive voices and champions within your public sector, what we have found is it's really helped accelerate progress and enables all the different parts to match up.
Thanks. Was there another question in the room? Yep, one over here, I believe.
Oh, thank you. My question is actually similar to the last one. I was just wondering, in terms of increasing the housing supply, and it goes to the people most in need, which means increasing the supply. Could you say anything about competing with the NIMBYs who don't want, say, higher housing density in their area, which means higher supply, or just investors and so forth? Because in Australia, it seems to me, there's just a lot of people who just don't want housing density in their area. And then it's also competing with investors. Yeah. Does that make sense? Great.
That makes perfect sense.
Yep, shall I say a little bit about how that's all set up? What happens is the Scottish Government asked local government to develop housing need and demand assessments so that they can work out who's on their housing list, what the needs are on a local basis, and they become the funding mechanism as well. So it will be done at a local area around what the planning assumptions are in there as well, as a really important aspect of all of this, how it all works through. And the directorate that I'm part of has local government, housing and planning all as part of it, to try to make sure that those links are really, really close all the time. And it's a really important aspect of as well. It's really interesting to hear about that issue about housing density, because that doesn't really feature much in the Scottish landscape at the moment. But it'll be really interesting to see as the 110,000 houses are being developed, when those questions start to come as well. We've had a big issue about what's called Airbnb, where individuals let out their own properties for a period of time and things like that as well. And there's been a lot of backlash against that. So there's some legislation that's trying to moderate that a bit as well. But that's been where the critical voices are, rather than the housing developments that the social landlords would actually develop.
Maybe just to add, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. It was just maybe to add a small point to that. I think I was reading recently that something like 90% of us in Scotland are concentrated in 2% of the land. So I know there's kind of similar kind of patterns of kind of concentration in Australia as well, but that in Scotland, across the Central Belt and up the East Coast is where the large majority of us live, with most of the rest uninhabitable, really round about the Highlands. I feel like this is a continuing tourist information. Come visit. But I think the point is around the housing projections and the targets about build are about social housing, not homeless housing. So some of that NIMBYism that you asked in your question features less because the plan is about creating more social and affordable housing at a local level, and therefore the idea of homelessness becomes less forefront.
So do you mean it's more politically popular to solve homelessness there, or to have more housing? Do you mean that too? Yeah.
There is a strong support for housing development and for increasing the rate of social and affordable housing for people that need it, for all local people that need it, including people that are homeless. So in a way, I guess what the support is for everybody to have their own home. Generally, the general public don't necessarily make that connection with homelessness.
How strange.
That might segue nicely to one of our online questions, which asks, how much has the success of the policy and its development relied on the human rights obligations that are embedded into the legal structures in Scotland, or on human rights as an advocacy framework? Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a crucial part of what we're doing there as well. And as I think the presentation has sort of showed, is that we're really pushing on that theme as well. Part of the Housing to 2040 has saying that right to housing is crucial in there, and how we would actually take that further forward. And it is that aspect about it's part of the human rights. And that's a bit where Scotland is more progressive than the UK government in this. I would put forward that argument there. I can see Maggie nodding, so that's good. But it's really there. It's not completely sorted yet. That's not something that I'd say, you know, it's definitely a work in progress about how we'll do it, but just put that, you know, right and centre about all the work that we're doing is a really important aspect of what we're trying to take forward. But Maggie will have more to say on that.
I mean, just a little. I mean, I guess that the universal right to housing that the 2012 target gave in Scotland has been incredibly enabling. And just in terms of people knowing that they have rights and have a right to exercise them. More recently, there's been commitments by Scottish politicians to increase Scotland's commitments to human rights, and particularly around about the right to adequate housing. There's a real appetite, it seems, at kind of political level in Scotland to really go further on human rights. The specific difference that could make in our context is about our ability to accommodate and house and support people that would otherwise not be able to be because of UK immigration laws. So people that now, because of Brexit, come from other parts of Europe, and also people that come from other parts of the world. So we hope that this greater commitment to housing through the Scottish Parliament's commitment to human rights will enable us to further how we can support people who we're currently not able to support as a result of immigration law.
Thank you. There's a question here, I think.
Hi, I'd just like to ask, does Scotland have specialist housing for people with mental health issues? And if so, what sort?
Yeah, what's really interesting is that there's a pilot programme that's happening just now around Housing First for people coming out of secure institutions around that as well. And it's people with the most complex needs, but it does seem to be having an impact and working on that as well. I think the whole Housing First programme has mental health, you know, right at the forefront of it all. I think that's something that is really important there as well. We recognise that access to mental health services is actually limited and really difficult, and it's one of the challenges that we have at the moment. But we're aided by the fact that the Minister for that area in Scottish Government is basically his last tenure was that he was a Minister for Homelessness, for Housing and Homelessness. So has a really clear understanding about the importance of housing, mental health, homelessness, and all the interactions between them. Is really making things move, but there's a way to go.
Yeah, we did have another question online here about that integration of health and social services with housing and with accountability across sectors, particularly at the prevention end of things. Just wondering if you had anything else to say about that, at that prevention space.
Yeah, I think that the prevention duties, Maggie is probably better placed than me to talk about directly. But I think that the intention there is that we try to integrate all of this work that's being done so it's not siloed, so that we can have a read across. There's certain areas, I think I mentioned, where it works really, really well. And it's almost like the access to it doesn't matter what sort of like tag you've got on you. So whether it's homelessness, whether it's sort of like vulnerabilities, whatever it is that you come in and you get sort of like a cross sectional response to that, and very much about the person-centered approach to that is the really important one. So it's like if you get all the different sort of like various types of support services, it's like going, what does this individual need, is the really important one for that. And let's break down any barriers that are constructed to stop this person getting the access to the support and the housing that they actually need.
Marion talked earlier about the integration of health and social care in Scotland in 2016. And again, that was another law. It wasn't just a practice. It was a law that was put in place by the Scottish Parliament to basically, well, instruct, local partners to integrate health and social care functions. Now, there's a couple of things to note in terms of that process that might be of interest. That first, the kind of overall strategies that each local area had to develop round about integrating health and social care must include a housing contribution statement. So a statement from local housing providers and others about how housing is the kind of third leg in that stool, to try and make sure that that real connectedness happens at local planning level, and more importantly at delivery level as well. And maybe the second point to make in health and social care strategies is the kind of mental health component, that this strategy that underpinned integration was one which was about supporting people as far as possible to live in their own place, in homes, in a community for as far as possible, with that underpinned for some being specialist shared accommodation for some people with mental health problems. And that approach, as Marion said, has also been tested out in the homelessness sector as well. So it's ordinary homes as far as possible, and then some specialist provision when that's needed.
You finished your presentation with that animation, and we've got a question here that is about, I guess, to what extent there was an advocacy or a public information component to the plan in its development, particularly, I guess, in the implementation of the plan. What was the approach, or was there much thought given to bringing the public on board and building general support for it?
Yeah, I think that's one of the areas where we still have a challenge. I think that's only fair to say about what's happening. There's been a lot of work done between the sort of the third sector and government about trying to pull all that together and tackle in particular stigma. But it's not straightforward, as you'd expect. And it is something that we want to progress with as well. It's part of the action plan about how we take that forward as well, because it is seen as a really important part. But we're not helped necessarily by the media, local media outlets. When they talk about homelessness, they put up a photograph of somebody sleeping rough. And so, we're trying really hard to say that that's really the minority of people's experiences. It's very much about people who become homeless, mainly in Scotland because of relationship breakdown, whether that's with a young person and their family, or whether it's people who live together just not being able to do so anymore, with or without violence. It's not on its own. And I think that's sort of like really important that people recognise that what homelessness is and what homelessness isn't. But we just sort of like keep plugging away at it and how we do it as well. But I think that all the work that we are doing in terms of getting the sector together around the action plan, and if we get the outcome framework sorted as well, then we'll have other ways that we can be able to promote what we're actually doing in this area, which I think is really important. Maggie, you got more?
Yeah, it's interesting. We have a partner organisation that kind of closely monitors public attitudes to things like homelessness and particularly how that's done through a large population-wide kind of public attitudes survey. And there was certainly a kind of a much more support for the issue of homelessness across the general population during the COVID, and that started unfortunately to tighten a little bit again since. I think there's something within those public attitude surveys, while we talk quite a lot about at policy level being a bit more progressive in Scotland than other parts of the UK, if that's safe to say. Actually, when we take that out to population level, it's pretty much the same, so we'll get people that are of course, think the way, we all do in this room. And then there are people that have much less tolerant views indeed. And actually, that's not much different in Scotland than it is around other parts of the UK, unfortunately. So there is still quite a lot of work to do to work on that as well. I think public perceptions and the development and creation of the plan, our focus wasn't thinking about the general public in terms of people that use homelessness services, who are of course members of the general public. And really our focus was indeed on them. And as I said, made huge efforts to work across the country. Every local authority area, including the Highlands and Islands, to go out and speak to over 400 people, which proportionately a country our size was a big undertaking. So that kind of was our priority in the development of the plan.
Well, thank you, Maggie. Thank you, Marion. Our time is coming to a close, so I will start to wrap it up now. But please join me in thanking Marion and Maggie for that most interesting presentation. And may I again acknowledge and thank Link Wentworth as our sponsor for this international plenary session as well. Thank you. A reminder once more that the recording of this session will be available for all delegates after the conference. You will receive further instructions later about how to access that. Please remember also to complete the session survey, because we do appreciate and value the feedback that you give us, and we'll use that to inform future session development. Before you depart for the day, this is our last formal session for the day. Thank you for your participation throughout the day. But I'd like to invite Michael Fotheringham back to the stage just to run through the end of the day housekeeping. And for those of you who have joined us online for this session, you are welcome to depart now for the day. Thank you for your presence, and we do look forward to seeing you again tomorrow when we start at 9 a.m. But thanks, Michael.
Thank you, Tom, and indeed thank you to Marion and Maggie for what I thought was a really inspiring session. Great to see what can be achieved through meaningful partnership between government and sector at a national level. Certainly, I think, food for thought for this country. Look, I am, as Tom said, here to just quickly wrap up the day and release you for the evening. I'll just acknowledge we've had a couple of audio-visual challenges today in a couple of the sessions. I apologise for that. Hopefully they're rectified and we won't have any further problem tomorrow. We did also have a number of requests, particularly for the transcript of Shane Hamilton's speech this morning, as he didn't use slides but actually had a prepared speech. And Shane has kindly agreed to provide that to us, so we'll make that available on the conference website in the coming days, along with the recording of that entire session. So of course you can rewatch his delivery of that and of all of the speakers from this morning's session. That was today. That feels like a while ago now, but that really inspiring session first thing today. There has been a lot. It's a really solid program, so I'll only keep you just a moment longer. Tonight is a free night. You are left to your own devices, but if you do need some tips on where to dine, the conference website does include a Canberra guide with many of the terrific restaurants around Canberra mentioned there, so you feel free to explore that. And also for those of you heading back to your hotel to relax, you may want to spend the evening watching a special film that's been made available to us as conference delegates exclusively. It's terrific. The film called Some Happy Day is an Australian indie feature film written, directed and produced by Catherine Hill. It's the story about Tina, a homeless woman in a desperate search for a better life, who meets Frances, a social worker with troubles of her own. And over a single day, their lives interweave, revealing unsettling connections that lead to change and redemption. So check that out. You can film that through the on-air portal from now or come back to it later, anytime between now and August 15. So that's a terrific opportunity. It's been a great program today. Thank you to all of the speakers involved and all the people who've asked questions and participated throughout the day. The virtual sessions have all been recorded and are being loaded onto the online portal and will be available over the next few days. Just a reminder for those of you who have booked for the breakfast tomorrow, it's an early start. The networking breakfast at the National Arboretum. We just mangled that. Buses will be collecting you from one of 7 locations, departing from 5:45 a.m. That is not a misprint. There is a notice outside the information desk with pickup times for each of the different locations. Dress warmly. It will be chilly, but the coffee will be hot, and the view, frosts permitting, apparently will be fantastic. Look, remember to make sure if you're coming to that to bring a mask and your lanyard. That's your entry pass to the breakfast, and of course the mask is certainly required for the buses. At the conclusion of the breakfast, buses will bring you back here when we will start at the convention centre again at 9 o'clock with the main program. For those not attending the breakfast, we'll be starting at 9 o'clock. And finally, if you're checking out of your hotel tomorrow morning and leaving straight from here, you're welcome to bring your luggage to the convention centre, and the cloakroom at the reception desk can store that for you during tomorrow's sessions. That's enough from me. Go and enjoy Canberra. Thank you very much.